Writers love to talk about writing, and famous writers love to write about writing. And today we're going to take a look at whether one of the most famous writers of our time actually gives good writing advice in his writing book. My name's Sam, a romance author based in the UK, and today we are taking a look at On Writing by Stephen King. Obviously, Stephen King is a very big name in the writing world, but this book as well is very big in the writing world. It was recommended reading for my MA. I've had it recommended to me about a dozen times other than that. It's seen as a really seminal work for people who want to be writers. But I had never read it before, so I thought, okay, let's read this book and see what it's all about. On Writing is a mix of memoir of Stephen King's life as well as what he says is practical advice about the craft. And sometimes it's really hard to separate his personal experience from what he's actually suggesting to other people. But there are plenty of times in the book that he's being very direct about his recommendation. And so when we're talking about the validity of the advice, I'm gonna focus on those areas. In terms of the memoir side of things, I'm gonna be honest, I didn't find it that interesting. It absolutely served to demonstrate that Stephen King has been interested in writing from a very young age, but his life wasn't particularly memoir worthy otherwise. And given that there's a really big chunk of the book that's dedicated to that, I found it a little bit tedious to get through, especially being right at the beginning. I would have preferred to sort of flash forward into his career a bit more to really get hooked, and then for the memoir to serve to further inform that later on. But that's not what we're here to talk about. When it comes to the advice, I think that this book can't really decide if it wants to be a really advanced book on writing or if it wants to be giving advice to brand new writers, because I think that a lot of the advice around how to craft sentences feels like really rudimentary, but then a lot of the other advice feels like it's speaking to people who are ready to buckle down and take it more seriously. One thing I think this book does do really well is it really combines the craft of writing with like the practicalities of building a writing practice, because you can have the best craft in the world, but without the right practice, you're not going to have the output that you want. And you can have the right practice, but without a knowledge of the craft, you're probably not going to be happy with the output that you do have. So I do like that this book addresses both. I'm not going to try to critique any of the advice that he gives on the craft side of things, because obviously it's Stephen King. He knows what he's doing when it comes to the craft. And also because it just felt like really solid advice. And I did feel like while I didn't learn anything new that I hadn't learned before, I found it to be a nice refresher of some things that I had heard before, learned in my MA, and practiced myself. The practical side of things is where I feel a little bit more equipped to critique. So Stephen King is very much an advocate of creating a consistent writing practice, which I am too, so really agree with this part. He talks about trying to write in the same place at the same time every single day. This is something that I myself have really worked to start doing as part of my creative practice, and I have found it to be really useful. And the reason is because it sort of trains your brain that when it's that time and you're in that place, you're going to write, and it makes it a lot easier over time to start to tap into that creative energy. He also talks about the importance of reading while you're writing, and that if you don't have time for reading, then you don't have the time or capacity for writing. And I think that that's true as well. I think you have to be filling up your creative cup in order to empty it, and reading is one of the ways that you do that. However, his definition of reading is maybe a little bit different than mine, and this is where the biggest gripe that I have with this book comes into play. In this book, Stephen King talks about how you should not watch television, which is really interesting because I did a little bit of digging, and in recent interviews, and by recent I mean more recent than this book was published, which was over 20 years ago, he's talked about some of the TV shows that he likes. And so I found this to be really interesting and maybe a little bit hypocritical. But I think that the reason for that is because what he meant by television when he wrote this book is different than the reality of television today. What he talks about in the book is how television basically is candy floss for your brain. It does nothing for you. It just entertains you and lets you turn your brain off, which, for the record, I don't think is a bad thing. I think people need to be able to do that. And I think denying people that and telling them that they should be doing something more intellectually productive with that time is actually counterproductive, because if your brain doesn't have that time to rest, it can't do what you want it to do. That's a total aside though. And if you think about the kinds of shows that were being made in the late 90s and early 2000s, I think that that probably makes more sense than it does today. He does talk about how much film mattered to him growing up and in his life at the time of writing this book. And if you look at television today, I think it's a lot more intelligent. It's a lot more self-aware in terms of its context within society. And I also think it's far more cinematic, and I don't think anyone would argue with me on that. But I also think that there's other things in our society now that are more like the mental candy floss that he talks about, like social media. That's one of the ways that I let my brain turn off, is I'll just sit there and start scrolling, and 20 minutes later, I'm super deep on a rabbit hole on Instagram, and I have no idea how I got there. I think that that's the kind of thing that he's talking about. But the way that he gives this advice, including about creating that habit around writing, it feels very all or nothing, and it can feel a little bit judgmental at times. And I think making people feel bad for not being able to carve out the same amount of time that you are doesn't make them any less of a writer. I mean, obviously Stephen King is a very renowned, very successful writer, but he's no more a writer than someone who writes for 5 minutes a day because that's all that they can manage. And I don't love the kind of air of creative snobbery that can sometimes come across in this book. I also think when he talks about the importance of reading, he definitely is not reading the kinds of books that I am necessarily. There's some crossover. Some of the writers that he talks about are ones that I've read as well, but he gives very specific lists of books and authors that you should be reading. And I promise you, my books are nowhere on this list. It's a lot of really heavy intellectual work, lots of high science fiction and fantasy, and it's stuff that honestly I don't have mental capacity for a lot of the time. Maybe if writing were my full-time job, then I would, but given that I have a full-time job aside from writing and I have other responsibilities, when I'm reading, sometimes I just want to turn my brain off the same way as when I watch a reality show or something like that. As I was trying to choose a practical thing to do for this week, because if you haven't seen my previous video in the series, I'm trying to choose something practical to take away and do for a week after reading these books. I really struggled with it for on writing because I already do a lot of the creative practice side of things that he talks about. The thing that I don't follow in terms of his advice is around television, which I put in air quotes because I don't think we're just talking about television here. I watch a lot of television. I love television. I watch it while I work sometimes if I'm doing something more menial. So this is definitely the biggest departure from what I currently do, but the idea of doing it for a week has me actually feeling a little bit nervous, not because I'm addicted to it and don't think I'll be able to deal without it, but more just because I want to do something relevant for this challenge and it feels irrelevant. I understand if I were replacing the time that I'm usually watching television with writing, like maybe that would be productive, but I'm not going to do that because that's not why I watch television. It's a very different energy and a very different capacity that I'm using for that activity, but I'm gonna do it anyway. I've also chosen to go more with like what I think he meant by television, which is going to include social media. Now, because I'm creating content and I'm trying to share it with people, I am going to give myself 30 minutes a day on social media so that I can continue to upload things and respond to comments and messages. But I'm going to set an app limit in my phone, Instagram and Facebook. Don't really spend a lot of time on other social media platforms, so I'm just gonna stick with these two for now and see how it goes. I'm gonna give myself 30 minutes every day, and that's to share across both of those platforms, and I'm turning that on. So there you go. Don't know if you can see that. So I'm going to not watch television and only use social media for 30 minutes a day for the next week. I'm going to attempt to include YouTube in that because I can sometimes just fall down a YouTube rabbit hole. The exception to that is there's a channel that my husband and I watch together every time they put out a video, and that's a really nice sort of bonding time with my husband, so I'm going to allow myself to watch that still. The goal of this is to see if it changes my writing practice in any way whatsoever. I don't think that it will. I'm really skeptical of the value of this in modern society, but I'm open to being wrong, open to learning at the feet of Stephen King if possible. So we're gonna give that a go. I'm gonna check in throughout the week and then do a bit of a recap at the end of the week to see how we got on. Okay, so I have just finished day 1 of not watching any TV and also my social media restrictions. It was a very, very busy day at work, so the social media restrictions were not a huge problem for me because I was kind of working nonstop, so I didn't really have a chance to do those. And I do still have like 20 minutes left for those 2 apps, so it should be plenty as I'm like lying in bed scrolling on my phone like you're not supposed to do. In terms of YouTube, I watched the video with my husband that we were supposed to watch, and then we were gonna watch another one, and I was like, I can't, I'm doing this challenge, and he was like, okay, fine. And then we just kind of went our separate ways, which, like, yes, we could have used that time to, like, I don't know, talk about our days or something, but we spent the whole day together, so I don't know. It was a bit weird to, I was like, well, what are you gonna do with this time instead? Nothing. I'm just gonna work more, I guess. I mean, I've got my specific time that I sit down to write, so it wasn't adding to that. I don't know. I'm still not totally on board with this challenge, but I am committed to trying it, so we're still going. And I am already like super failing at it. That's not true. I haven't watched television because it's like 9 o'clock in the morning and I managed to not watch any this morning. I listened to an audiobook instead. But then I was just eating breakfast and I just started randomly scrolling social media, and I like set the time limit on the apps as well, and I honestly have no idea how much time I just spent on Instagram. Like none. Like I think it was like 20 minutes, which means I've used almost all of my time for the day, and I didn't post anything, and I didn't even realize I was doing it, so this is gonna be a hard habit to break. I got a notification that I had 5 minutes left for Instagram and Facebook as I was in the middle of responding to a Facebook comment. So yeah, I think this first day has been a bit difficult on the social media front, less difficult on the TV front, although I do think that some of the productive stuff I've gotten done, I probably wouldn't have gotten done if I had been letting myself watch TV. Tonight's not going to be difficult because I've got friends coming over, so the real test is going to be over the weekend, which would usually be like total veg zone, but it's fine because I have a ton of work on my nano project to do. So I will keep you posted.
Helpless child, and it was so good. It felt so isolated, so chilling because it's set.
So as you will have just seen from that clip, I massively failed on the television situation. I ended up having a lot of my calls canceled today. It was my last day of work before the Christmas break, and I was just like getting work done as if this is how I typed. Just was watching YouTube while I did it, and I watched a little bit of TV as well, and then I was like, I'm gonna put on a film, and films weren't explicitly forbidden, so I was gonna do that, but then as I was picking out a film, I saw a TV show I wanted to watch instead, and it just, Anyway, I failed, and I don't even care because I wasn't gonna use that time for anything else. I was working. I was literally working. It wasn't distracting me from my work. I just like, I think that the way my brain works, I either am in like hyper productivity mode and I need my brain to be doing like the work that I'm doing and be occupied with something else like on a screen, or I'm in like shut my brain off mode, in which case I just want something on the screen. But like having the multiple things going on at once, you tell me what that says about me. I don't even know, but it's just working for me, and I just think that Stephen King and I are at 2 different places in terms of how our brains work, and that's okay. So sorry, Stephen King, I failed your challenge. We do have 1 more day to go, and the social media part is actually still going okay. I ended up deleting Facebook off my phone completely because I just found myself going like deep into like comment sections, which just makes me hate the world. So I am gonna keep the social media situation going for the next day, and then I'll report back in. Okay, so I have finished my week of trying to follow Stephen King's advice, and it didn't work. I really tried for the first like 3 days to not watch television, and it was very difficult, but I mostly managed. I do think, however, that my philosophy on it is very different from Stephen King's. Also, I think that it's okay to just like turn off your brain sometimes, and if TV is a way that allows you to do that and makes you feel comfortable and rested, there is no problem with that. Also, in those 3 days where I wasn't watching television, I wasn't replacing that time with anything more meaningful. I was still just chilling. Like maybe I was listening to an audiobook, but those are the times when I'm listening to a book that is maybe a little bit on the lighter side. I just finished like a YA romance, for example. So I feel like there's so many different ways to like do what he would think of as television. And I think to try to tell people that doing that is wrong and going to harm their writing practice is maybe a bit pretentious and untrue in a lot of instances. Stephen King is obviously a huge heavy hitter in the industry, but I think this is one area where his advice is really flawed. So on writing, what's my verdict? I think you can probably give it a miss. I think that given the wealth of information about writing and about building a creative practice out there, I feel like you're more likely to find some up-to-date, relevant information from other sources. It feels really sacrilegious to say that and to give Stephen King anything other than 5 stars, but I'm giving the book 3 stars and I don't think that I would recommend it to most people. I also reviewed Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott, which if you haven't seen that, I'll leave the link in the description. That one I found to be much more essential and I would definitely recommend it. I'm also really excited to read a couple of other books that have been on my list for a while, including The Emotional Craft of Fiction, which I've heard is fantastic. So if you don't want to miss that, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.